Mystery Monday video. Today we will be talking about the disappearance of Tara Calico, which took place back in 1988. This case is kind of insane. Just how it was handled is really weird, so we will just get right into it. Tara Calico was one of those extremely organized and extremely structured people. She was very athletic. She loved to run. She loved to go for long bike rides. After she graduated high school, she began attending the University of New Mexico at Valencia, and she was very smart. She did really well in school. She was studying to go into psychology. She also worked, and she was in a relationship with a man named Jack Cole, who had been like this big football star in high school when they began dating. Tara was just this very well-liked, popular girl, and they really made that all-American couple. Due to Tara's extreme organization, she kept a schedule of her days. She had everything she needed to get done, as well as various events, all scheduled out. Like, basically, Tara would wake up and she would know what she would be doing at every moment. Everything was scheduled until she went to bed that night, and this helped her stay organized because she was very busy. Most mornings she would wake up and take a long bike ride to clear her head. And when I say long bike ride, it was 40 miles round trip, and it usually took her like 4 to 5 hours to complete. On the morning of September 20th, 1998, Tara woke up and she wanted to go for her usual bike ride, but for whatever reason she was running a little behind that morning. So she left the house at 9:30 a.m. and she had plans to go play tennis with her boyfriend at 12:30, and then she also had a class at 4 p.m. So she leaves on her bike, but before she leaves, she says to her mom, "Hey, I'm not sure if I can make it back by noon. If I'm not back by then, will you just come get me? Because I need to be ready to go play tennis and stuff at 2. So she leaves on her mother's bright pink Huffy bike because her bike had a flat tire. She heads for Highway 47, which was the road that she would take for most of her ride. At 12 p.m., Tara's mom, Patty, realizes Tara isn't home yet, so she gets in her car and takes off on Highway 47 to go pick up Tara. Patty was expecting to run into Tara close to the home because, well, she obviously didn't have time to make her full loop. She should be, getting closer to home. But as she drove further and further down the highway, she began to become a little uneasy. Once in a while, Patty would past each other. So she looks in the garage for the pink Huffy bike, but it wasn't there. Patty decided to drive the route one more time, hoping maybe she had just somehow missed her daughter along the highway. After making one more loop without seeing any sign of her daughter, Patty decides to search the area where they lived, thinking maybe because she did get such a late start, she just tried to shorten her route or took a different one. She comes back home to check the garage again, and the bike still isn't in there. At this point, Patty's pretty scared because it's 12:35 and Tara should have been home by now. So Patty calls the police to alert them that her daughter is missing, but they're not super concerned. She's an adult, and she probably had just gone somewhere without telling her mother, which she has the right to do because she's an adult. And so they aren't really interested in trying to help Patty track Tara down at that point. Patty tried to explain to them that Tara hadn't just run away. She was very happy. She had a great job. She loved school. Like, she had a great relationship with her mother and stepfather. She wouldn't have just taken off. So, Tara's boyfriend is supposed to be meeting her to play tennis, and when she never shows up, he calls Tara's house, and this is when he learns that Tara is missing. He rushes to Tara's house, and when he arrives, Tara's mother and stepfather, Patty and John Dill, along with Jack Cole, decide to go out and search for Tara. While they are looking for her, they run into a few people. The first group of people are just like some men working on a fence on the side of the highway. They say that they had not seen her, but they had left around 11:30 to go get lunch, so maybe they missed her. They said they would keep their eyes out for Tara, and they seemed like super helpful. So the three of them had started out searching for Tara together, but quickly they realized they'll be able to cover more ground if they all split up. And so they all decide to split up and then meet back up in an hour. Patty was searching around the entrance to the JFK campground, and she noticed this gray truck with like a homemade camper on the back. And there were three men just kind of hanging out, drinking beer outside of the truck. She asked them if they had seen a girl riding a pink bike, and they said that they hadn't, but they were not as interested. They didn't seem as concerned as the first group of men that she had talked to. They were just a little bit dismissive, and after they said, no, we didn't see her, they just kind of stared at Patty until she walked away. A while later, Jack, John, and Patty all meet up, so they're all kind of just trading notes. Who did you talk to? What did they say? Did you see her bike? Did you find her? And they all decide that this, like, white, it was described as a dirty white or gray truck with a homemade camper on the they find the men are still there, but for whatever reason, they've moved the truck to a different spot. So that's a little bit weird. Over the course of this search for Tara, investigators found several witnesses who had seen Tara riding her bike along Highway 47, but most of the witnesses who had noticed her hadn't seen anything suspicious. A few witnesses did tell investigators that they had noticed a dirty white or light gray Ford pickup truck with a white homemade shell that seemed to be following Tara. It seemed that Tara wasn't even aware that she was being followed. Now whenever she would go on these long bike rides, she would take her Walkman with her and listen to a cassette tape. So all these witnesses said she didn't even seem to realize that there was a truck kind of slowly following her. It's possible because she was listening to music, she wasn't super aware of her surroundings. Police find a witness who they believe may have been the last person to see Tara at 11:45 a.m. in Valencia County, just 2 miles from her home. So, other than a few people who noticed the Ford truck, there was nothing really suspicious. There was no sign of foul play, and police hadn't found any trace of Tara or her bike. The next day, Tara's mother began searching the highway for her daughter, or for any clues as to where she might have been. As she searched the area, she came across something that stopped her in her tracks. Patty finds a Boston cassette tape that belonged to Tara, which was found just 3 miles from their house. She also noticed bike tracks and skid marks near where the tape was found that seemed to point to the fact that Tara and a car traveling along the highway, or both, had come to a very abrupt stop near each other. Sometime later, the local police found another piece of evidence near the JFK campground. They found part of Tara's broken Walkman along with a broken bike reflector. So while police had finally found something of Tara's, they weren't able to take this Walkman and with it determine that a crime had been committed. After all, maybe she dropped it and somebody picked it up and brought it to the campground. It was definitely suspicious, but the discovery of these items didn't prove that foul play had been happening. Now, Walkmans were very popular in the 80s, and I could never find any information as to how police were positive that this Walkman belonged to Tara. But her mother did ID it as belonging to her, and she said she felt like Tara was leaving breadcrumbs for her to follow. First, the cassette tape was found, then part of the Walkman, so she felt like she was trying to leave a trail so that she could be found. Police did believe foul play was involved, although they had no physical evidence to suggest that theory. It was believed that Tara they were unable to track it down. Several weeks went by and there was just no sign of Tara. No evidence, nothing for police to follow. And soon, Tara's case went cold for about 9 months. Then, on June 15th of 1989, in Port St. Joe, Florida, a Polaroid picture was discovered in a parking lot 17,000 miles away from where Tara disappeared. A woman had walked out of a grocery store, and when she looked down, there was a Polaroid picture in an empty parking spot. The photo showed 2 unknown people who were bound and gagged with tape over their mouths. One was a girl, late teens to early 20s, along with a young boy who was believed to be roughly like 10 to 13 years old. In this picture, the boy is seen laying on his side with his head on a pillow and his arms behind his back. The girl was laying on her back with her hands underneath her. They're laying on sheets and it looks like they're in some sort of, like the back of a cargo van. Both people in the photo look terrified, and there was also a book laying next to the 2 in the photo. The woman who happened to find this picture said that where she had found the picture, there had been a white, windowless Toyota cargo van driven by a man with a mustache who looked to be in his early 30s. So police set up roadblocks and they did safety checks trying to find this van. But this van was never located. They ended up contacting Polaroid, who was able to examine the photo and stated that it had to have been taken after May of 1989, which was just 1 month earlier. They were able to determine this because of the type of film that the picture had been printed on. It was like a new film that had only been available for about a month. The discovery of this picture was a huge deal, and soon it was a really big story in the news. Several news stations showed the image of the 2 and hoped that it would drum up some tips so they could ID the 2 possible victims. In July of 1989, the photo was shown on the TV show A Current Affair, and a friend of Tara's mother happened to be watching this show and showed the picture to Patty, who identified the girl in the photo as her daughter, Tara Calico. In the meantime, the family of a missing 9-year-old boy named Michael Henry had also ID'd him as the boy in the photo. He had gone missing while on a camping trip with his family in northwest New Mexico in April of 1988. After meeting with law enforcement and looking over the picture, both sets of parents, were convinced that it was their will just point out that the author of this book, V.C. Andrews, happened to be a very popular author at the time, and all the teenage girls were really into her books. So it would kind of be like J.K. Rowling or, Stephen King, like very popular authors. Tara's mother died in 2006, still claiming she was positive the girl in the picture was her daughter. Like, to the very end, she was certain that that was Tara. Scotland Yard ended up using their lab to try and analyze the photo, and they concluded that the woman in the photo was, in fact, Tara Calico. However, the Los Alamos National Laboratory concluded it was not Tara. The FBI also ran an analysis of the photo, but their results were inconclusive. The only thing that we know for sure about the picture is that it was taken in the back of a cargo van, just like the one the witness said had been parked in that very spot when she had gone into the store. We also know that along the spine of the book in the photo, there's a phone number written, or it appears to be a phone number. But because the photo was such low quality, they were never able to determine what the phone number was. Police have come out and said there's something like 300 different possibilities of phone numbers that it could be, although only 57 of those numbers were actual, like, working numbers. After the photo was discovered, police searched the area and found several witnesses who claimed to have seen a girl walking along the beach in Port St. Joe days before the photo was found. She looked very similar to the girl in the photos, and these witnesses said she was always surrounded by several white adult men who seemed to be, like, ordering her around or in charge of her. The discovery of the photo sparked a new interest in the Tara Calico case. What they did know was that the scar on the girl's leg was identical to Tara's scar. The hairline seemed to be the same, as well as the ear. information when it comes to the photo. Investigators have still never been able to determine if Tara was in fact the girl in the photo. Over the years, there have been reported sightings of Tara, but they were never able to be verified, and Tara's case stayed cold for 20 years. Then, Port St. Joe Police Chief David Barnes received 2 letters in June and August of 2009. The letters came postmarked from Albuquerque, and inside of them were photos. The first letter had a photo of a boy printed on copy paper with black tape drawn over his mouth in ink. The second letter contained an original photo of the boy. On August 12th, the Star newspaper in Port St. Joe received a third letter. This was also the same boy with tape drawn over his mouth, and it is unknown if these photos have any kind of link to the Polaroids, but because they came from New Mexico, and both of the people believed to be in that photo were also from New Mexico, police wanted to try to determine if there was in fact some sort of link. The photo of the boy were sent to the FBI in hopes of being able to get fingerprints or some sort of trace DNA lifted from them. Around the same time that the photos began arriving in Port St. Joe, a psychic claimed to have known a girl who she believed was Tara Calico, who she knew when she lived in California. According to the psychic, she worked in a strip club with the woman, and this woman was eventually murdered. And after she died, this psychic started having dreams that the woman was Tara Calico. She even thought the woman was buried in California, but police were never able to identify any evidence to support these claims. The weird thing in this case is how photos kept appearing that ended up leading to more questions instead of helping police, get any answers. It was also rumored that police have received more photos that they just never released to the media. There was rumors of another Polaroid that had been taken on film that wasn't available until 1989. This photo was found near a construction site in Montecito, California, and shows a girl's face with her mouth covered in duct tape. The image is blurry, and Tara's mother said she doesn't know if that is her daughter. In this photo, the girl's head is resting on a blue striped fabric, which is similar to the pillow found in the first Polaroid. Another photo was taken on film, not available until 1991, and it shows a woman who is bound and gagged with gauze, and around the time that these letters started arriving in Port St. Joe, authorities in New Mexico received new information regarding Tara's case. The Valencia County Sheriff said he had information that could solve Tara's case. He said there had been 2 teen boys driving when Tara was riding her bike. They were kind of harassing her, and that during the harassment, the boys accidentally hit Tara with their car. And then they think maybe they took Tara from the scene so they didn't get in trouble. gone missing from. According to the sheriff, several people may be involved in this case. Even though the sheriff kind of said this, there was no new information coming to light. There were no suspects that were identified, no arrests were made, and no sources were given as to where this information came from. Now, there are a lot of people who believe Tara never left Valencia County, and I am one of them. And so we're going to talk about why that is now. So, Melinda Esquivel is a classmate of Tara's. They hadn't really been good friends, but Melinda remembers Tara was just very kind, and they one time went on a trip together, like a school band trip or something like that, and Melinda had no friends. She was very shy, she was super uncomfortable, and she remembers Tara, like, noticing this and kind of bringing her in and, you know, saying, hey, just hang out with me and my friends, and that was something Melinda never forgot. So, Melinda grows up and she leaves the area, and she never forgot about Tara. Like, that case was always in the back of her mind. So one time she comes back for a visit and she finds out something that deeply affects her. She had been out hanging out with some old friends from high school. They had all gathered, and somehow Tara's name got brought up, and Melinda was like, I have always wondered what happened to her. And everyone was like, everyone knows what happened to her. And she was like super confused. She's like, what are you guys talking about? Her case isn't solved. And then people started saying like little bits of rumors and things that they had heard over the years, and Melinda was kind of able to piece together that Tara had died in Valencia County the day she went on her bike ride, but the entire thing had been covered up. So the men who allegedly killed Tara were like well connected, and so it had been covered up. In college, Melinda had studied filmmaking, and so she decides she's gonna make a film about Tara's disappearance. She really always liked her, and she wanted to shed some light on the situation and look into if her murder was this huge cover-up. So, she begins to work on it, and Tara's stepsister Michelle also becomes involved, and the two kind of start investigating together. They were given access to the police records, and they were so excited. They thought they would have all these answers if they could just get their hands on the police records. But the police records were just a huge mess. There was a lot of stuff that had been misfiled. There were names of witnesses missing. There seemed to just be like a huge chunk of information completely missing from the files. There was a list of interviews that had been done over the years. However, the audio tapes and transcripts were missing. Now, either the police were just truly horrible at their job and unorganized and lazy, or something bigger was going on. Okay, so real quickly, we are going to talk about the sheriff who was over the case. Sheriff Lawrence Romano Sr. was this very well-liked and well-known man issues, and one day he decided, like, this is not how I want to go out. And so he kind of has this come to Jesus moment and cleans himself up and gets his life back together. Even while he was like a full-blown alcoholic, he was still reported to have been a very good sheriff. So this will all tie in. I feel like I'm jumping around, but as with conspiracies, I will tie it all in at the end, okay? So this sheriff is in charge of Tara's case. So now that we know who was in charge of her case, I'm going to go over the background of some of the witnesses in the case, because there were several people who had saw Tara riding her bike when she went missing. Okay, so the first set of witnesses were 3 adults and 1 child who had been hunting in JFK campground, or like near it, but they had pulled over near the entrance to discharge their firearms, and they noticed Tara riding her bike. And they noticed a dirty white or gray truck with a homemade camper on the back following her. And they just kind of thought, you know, this must be her father or like brother, just following her slowly. It seemed apparent to them that she was being followed, just to make sure that she, you know, got home okay. Like, she wanted to go for a bike ride, so her dad was following her just so she was safe. So they didn't really think much of it, and they didn't do anything about it. Once they came forward to tell police what they had seen, they did take Sheriff Romano to the place where they had last seen Tara. And this was right where her Walkman and the broken bike reflector had also been discovered. In the police files, it says that they tried to hypnotize the hunters to see if they would remember more information, hoping to get them in like a relaxed trance-like state so they might remember more details. But everything that was said during those sessions is missing from the police files. Another witness was a man named Ishmael, and he saw Tara riding her bike that day. So he was driving to pick up some cattle, and he also was pulling his trailer with a dead calf in it. He was taking the calf to the vet to get an autopsy done. He needed to know why the calf had died. If there was like a virus or an illness going around, he needed to know that so he could know how to treat all of his other cattle. So he is kind of stressed out on this day. He has this appointment with the vet, and he is driving, and all of a sudden he comes upon this truck, this dirty white or gray truck with a homemade shell, and it's driving super slow. And you know how frustrating it is when you're in a hurry and someone's driving like under the speed limit. He was super frustrated. Now on Highway 47, it's just a 2-lane highway, and it's pretty narrow, so he's pulling this big trailer and he can't pass the truck, so he's like super annoyed. The truck in front of him he described as a 1940s Ford truck, being dirty white or possibly gray, and having the homemade camper on the back. When he first saw the truck, he actually thought it was this is just like her dad or somebody following her to make sure that she is safe. Or maybe, she was training for something, and if she got tired, she could just, the person would just pick her up. He does remember thinking it would be very difficult to get her bike through the small door of the makeshift camper. At one point, traffic on the other side of the highway slows down, and he finally has a chance to pass the truck. He pulls up next to the truck and looks over at the driver. Ishmael said he noticed the driver was staring at the girl on the bike, like he wasn't necessarily watching the road. He was intently staring at this girl in like a weird way. In fact, it was at that moment he realized this can't be her father. Like, he would not be looking at her that way if it was like a family member. He also noticed the driver had very bright red hair. He had clean cut hair. It was short. He had a little bit of stubble on his face, and he was wearing one of those hats with flaps that comes down over your ears. Ishmael said his eyes looked bloodshot and his face looked a little swollen, kind of puffy. He saw that on the left side of the driver's face he had a scar from his eye to his temple. He never saw the other passenger in the car. There was someone else in the car, but he couldn't see anything. He's passing and he's trying to drive his truck and also get a good look, but he really didn't know anything about the other passenger. At this point, Ishmael feels like something weird is going on here, and he is concerned for the girl's safety. It's so obvious this truck is following her. So Ishmael passes the truck and he's trying to figure out what to do. Something just doesn't feel right to him. But he's running late and he needs to get, to this appointment. So as he's driving, he sees a few people up ahead. He sees two men along the highway. He sees a couple cars parked off to the side. One has its hood up and there's a few people gathered around it. And then there's a golf course with some older women golfing right there. So he decides the girl will be safe because it's daylight and there's all these witnesses along the highway. So he decides to just go on with his day. Then he hears about Tara going missing on a news report. But on all the news reports, they just keep saying that Tara had gone missing from a mountain region, and they weren't saying she was along the highway, so he doesn't put two and two together until later. He's having lunch with a friend, and he's like, I wonder why that girl would be just riding through the mountains. And the friend's like, well, she was along Highway 47. And that is where he makes the connection. So his friend calls the tip line, and someone from the sheriff's department gets a hold of him. The person from the sheriff's department was named Ray Flores from the Valencia County Sheriff's Department, who was the captain just under Sheriff Romano. So Ray Flores interviews Ishmael, but Ishmael later said the way he was treated during his interview was kind of shocking. He felt like he had information that could break the case, and the captain was kind of treating him like he was just being really annoying and he just had to come get his report, but that it wasn't going to be helpful to them. So he asks Ishmael a few follow-up questions after he's given his statement, and then says, maybe we should meet and you can look through some pictures of trucks so we can narrow down the exact make and model of this truck that you're describing. So they had made plans to meet at a restaurant the next day, and the captain never showed up. And Ishmael tried calling a few times, but he could never get anyone to call him back, and no one ever followed up with him or tried to make contact. A year later, he was in Albuquerque, and he happened to see this exact truck with the shell on the back. So he goes back to the Valencia Sheriff's Department and tells them, I was in Albuquerque and I saw this truck. Like, you could really tell that Ishmael was carrying a lot of guilt over not doing something the day that Tara went missing. Anyway, so he goes back and he tells them about this truck, but they do nothing. In July of 1989, Ray Flores finally gets in touch with Ishmael, and they ask him if he will come in and meet with a police sketch artist to make a composite sketch. When the police seem to finally want to talk to Ishmael, it's been a while since Tara has gone missing, and so he, in the meantime, has been hearing some rumors around town, and so he decides while he's finally in the police station and he has officers listening to him, he's gonna tell them about some of the rumors that he's been hearing around town. So Ishmael had a friend named Jack Aqueo, and Jack Aqueo had said he believed his grandson Gigi was somehow involved in Tara's disappearance. So Ishmael had been at his friend Jack's house. They had been talking about Tara's disappearance, and Gigi overheard them and came out and said, yeah, me and my friends were hunting and we saw her the day she disappeared. And then he left the room, and his grandfather turned to Ishmael and said, I just feel like he has something to do with what happened to that girl. Jack Aqueo owned this large ranch. He had a ton of property, and he even confided in his friend that he thought it was possible Tara was buried somewhere on his property. When investigators tried to interview GJ about this, they found that he had kind of disappeared. They tracked him to Texas, where he was receiving inpatient care at a mental institute. And so then they go to his grandfather, and he really kind of clams up and backsteps a lot and just says he doesn't want to talk to police about it and refused to cooperate. On September 11th, 1991, a search warrant for Jack Aqueo's property was filled out, signed, and enacted. In the sheriff's report, there is no information to be found about the search. There's no paper trail to say what happened when they went to the property, if they found anything. It's like it never happened. In 2010, Ishmael ends up dying. Until his dying day, every time he drove around anywhere, he was like keeping his eyes out for this truck or the man he had seen driving it. So another one of the witnesses was a man named Baron Freeman. So as Melinda is investigating Tara's case, she finds this email from a man named Baron, and he said he had seen Tara riding her bike on the day she went missing. So they have the email, but there's nothing to suggest police ever followed up after they had received this email from Baron. So in 2010, Melinda and Michelle end up tracking him down. According to Baron, he had tried to call police and let them know what he had seen the day Tara went missing, but no one ever called him back. They just never followed up with him. In September reading this article about Tara's disappearance, and in this article, the sheriff says they have a good idea of who is responsible, but they have no evidence, and her body has never been found, so they can't really do anything about it. The sheriff says that she was likely accidentally hit while riding her bike on the road, and whoever hit her, panicked and hit her body to cover it up. But Barron knew this wasn't exactly the case because Barron had seen her that day, and he was so upset by this article that he ends up getting a hold of the author who had written it, and finally gets a hold of the sheriff's office. So Renee Rivera was the sheriff of Valencia County 20 years after Tara went missing, and finally Barron is able to sit down and tell a police officer what happened and give his official statement. Barron says that the day Tara went missing, he was on his way to the airport and he was driving through the area. Now, he wasn't familiar with the area at all, and he kept getting lost, and he kept having to turn around and find his way back and turn around, and he was super flustered and very unfamiliar with the area. He said it had been really rainy in the previous days, so the sky was gray, everything was just kind of darker than it normally was, and he drives up over this hill and he immediately sees this hot pink bike with a girl on it riding northbound, and he's riding southbound. So he notices Tara, and then he notices a dirty white truck. He said the truck was like an old junker. It looked really beat up. And as he passed the truck, he noticed the driver, who he thought was around 50 years old and was a white male. He said he really remembers the driver because his hair was bright red, and he remembers feeling super creeped out by the way the driver was staring at Tara. Barron thought what all the others had. This has to be her dad or brother or somebody just making sure she gets to where she's going safely. But the way the driver was staring at Tara wasn't very fatherly. It was creepy. So in the meantime, Barron's lost. He needs to flip around again, so he decides not to flip around right behind the truck, but to go down the roadways and flip around and come back up. And he's like, I'll get the license plate number. I'll kind of see what's going on here. So he has nothing to write the driver's license plate down with. He's just trying to remember the number in his head. And he's like, okay, I'm gonna drive by and I'm gonna look at her, and if she's in trouble or anything like that, she'll give me a look, she'll try to give me a signal or a sign or something. So he flips around and he pulls up and he looks over at Tara, and she doesn't even acknowledge his presence. She doesn't even look up. She doesn't look over. She totally ignores him. So he's like, well, she's fine. She obviously is fine. She doesn't need my help. So he decides to just make his way down to the airport. He said he drove about 10 miles and the sky just started pouring this super hard, heavy rain. And he thought to himself, oh, that girl's getting wet. Maybe I should go back and see if she needs a ride. But decides against it and just drives to the airport. Barron didn't think about the girl or the incident until over a year later, when he happened to be reading an article about Tara's disappearance. In the article, it describes Tara in her pink believe she was abducted by someone in a white truck. But because Barron had been lost, he didn't even know for sure if he was in the area, like, that they were looking into, so he decides not to call police. But then, like, 10 years later, Barron's wife ends up working out at the gym with Tara's cousin, and they start talking about Tara, and she ends up getting Patty's number, and Barron calls Patty. He had always, like, carried this really heavy guilt because he knew something was off and he hadn't stopped. So he meets with Patty and he tells Patty the story, and after hearing the story, Patty says to him that he should not feel guilty at all because Tara was so independent and so strong-willed. If he had pulled up and asked her, "Hey, are you okay? Are you in trouble?" she probably would have just told him to get lost. So she's like, "Please don't feel guilty." She wouldn't have even let you help her. So Captain Don DeGrasse was the officer who ended up taking Barron's statement. So, as Melinda is investigating all of this, she goes and asks DeGrasse if Baron Freeman had ever been put under hypnosis, because they had put all of the other witnesses under hypnosis to see if they remembered anything else. And Don said, "No, we didn't do that because Baron was never at the scene." He said that he had looked up the weather report and it had been a clear, like, sunny day, and in his report he kept talking about how rainy it was. So they knew he was not a good witness because he wasn't ever at the scene. Like, their crime happened on a sunny day and he keeps describing a rainy day. But here's the thing. So Melinda has obviously done more research than, like, any of the police officers involved in Tara's case, but every single person that she had spoken to about that day said it was like a gray, drizzly day. All the pictures taken that day of the search for Tara Calico were taken. It shows gray skies. And there's even news reporters interviewing the police the day Tara went missing. And in the footage, it's raining. Okay, so the last witness wants to keep her identity anonymous. And that's sad because there's so much, like, cover-up going on. These witnesses are afraid for their life. But anyways, I'm going to call her Witness 1. So there is a whole blog, like a whole website and podcast that Melinda Escobel has out there, which is where I got a ton of this information. And she just calls this Witness 1. So that's what I will call Witness 1. So Witness 1 and Tara knew each other. They weren't super close friends, but they knew each other. And Witness 1 would often pass Tara on her morning bike rides when Witness 1 was on her way to college. And so she kind of knew that Tara always did her morning bike ride because she always passed her. So, on the day that Tara took that last bike ride, Witness 1 saw Tara and waved to her, and Tara waved back. Now, as she had turned on to Highway 47, she had pulled in front of a dirty white or gray truck, and she remembers the driver giving her a really dirty look, and she just was like, sorry, I must have cut you off. But she needed to get to school, so she didn't think much of it. Later that evening, Witness 1 finds out from her boyfriend that Tara is missing, and she says, I saw Tara, so I should probably call police. There was this truck kind them around town. This was a very small town. Everybody kind of knew everybody. So she looks at the photos and she IDs the driver of the truck. Then the detectives leave and they're like, thank you for your help. If your information pans out, or if we need anything more from you, we'll contact you. And they never did. So she figured, they had ruled out that driver that she had seen, and she didn't really think much of it. Until one day, she's reading an article, and it is about the tragic death of Lawrence Romano Jr. And if that name sounds familiar to you, that is the sheriff's son, the sheriff who was in charge of Tara's case for years. The picture that is accompanied by the article about his death was the exact photo that she had picked out of the lineup years earlier. Witness 1 had so easily identified him all those years ago because of his distinctive red hair. The sheriff's son had died of a suicide, or in this article they said he may have been playing Russian roulette, but either way, there was a gun involved and he died. As Witness 1 began looking into the case, she started to realize there was a massive cover-up going on. Lawrence Romano Sr. had been in charge of Tara's case, and as soon as his son was being named the possible suspect, that entire department should have handed over the case to another department, because that is a huge conflict of interest. But they didn't. And suddenly, all of these things are being left out of case files. And as it would turn out, even Witness 1's original statement to police never made it in to Tara's case file at the police department. All this stuff just disappeared. Okay, so remember Ishmael's friend Jack, who had a grandson named JJ? Well, JJ had said that a kid named Paul Seiler was with him hunting the day that Tara went missing. And so JJ, I don't know whatever happened to him. I could never find any information as to where he is or what happened to him. But Paul Seiler was questioned, and he said that he and JJ were in a silver or gray flatbed truck, and he said he no longer owns the truck, he sold it. So while he's being interviewed, no one tells him that JJ has already told several people that 3 men, like him and 2 friends, were going camping together and saw Tara. They don't let Paul know that they already know he saw her that day. So they ask him if he saw a girl on a pink bike, and he was like, nope. Super cocky. This kid had to have known he would never get in trouble for anything, because he was not worried at all that he was being questioned like this. He was just super arrogant. So he says that him and JJ went to hunt for a few days, and police ask him if he has a camper on the back of his truck, and he says no. And then they ask him, well, if you were camping for a couple days, where did you sleep? And he said that they just slept in a tent. So JJ claims there had been 3 of them together that day. Paul says that wasn't the case. He says there were only 2 of them. There were never 3 of them. They never had plans to take a 3rd friend. He says he never knew Tara or met her, and he also doesn't know Lawrence Jr. Now remember, this was a pretty small town. Everyone kind of knew everyone. Even witness one said that the man she was IDing seemed familiar to her. So it's strange in such a tight-knit community that two boys who were the same age didn't know each other. But police actually find out they did know each other. Paul and Lawrence Jr. were like party buddies. They drank together, they did drugs together. Like, these two men did for sure know each other, and they knew each other well. There had been a lot of inconsistencies in Paul's statement to police, so they end up calling him and asking him to come back in, and he lawyers up and refuses to speak to police. A girl who used to hang out with these boys later came forward and said that she used to hang out with JJ back in the day, and one time he brought her to this weird cave, and he was possibly high on drugs at the time, but he just started like kind of pouring his heart out to this girl and asking her, like, you know, did you hear what happened to Tara? And then he kind of confesses to this girl that he knows what happened to Tara, but he can't do anything about it because the sheriff's son is involved. So, there is this old man named Henry Brown, and he is really, really sick, and he's dying, and he decides to make this deathbed confession. Henry Brown requests a deputy comes to his house, and he tells them that when he was younger, he used to hang out with a really, like, rowdy, wild group of boys. They did a lot of drugs, they did a lot of things they shouldn't. According to him, Lawrence Jr. was his drug dealer, and Lawrence Jr. lived in this trailer, and they all hung out in the trailer. And one night they were all like drinking and doing drugs, and they started talking about Tara. Now, this man says Lawrence Jr. was very attracted to Tara. He was very romantically interested in her. He asked her out several times, and she always just kind of politely said no because she had a boyfriend. So this is the first witness to ever say Lawrence Jr. like had a crush on Tara. Anyway, he said they start talking about Tara, and the boys all kind of claim that they were involved in what happened to Tara. They claimed they were following her that day on her bike, and they hit her with the bike on purpose. And then they like grabbed her and pulled her into the truck, and they took turns sexually assaulting her. And then she threatened to go to the police, and so they killed her. Lawrence Romano Jr. claimed she was hidden in a makeshift basement under his trailer, and they kept her there for a while before they moved her body and buried it in a pond. When Henry heard this, he was like really freaking out. He was like, oh my gosh, you guys, is this true? And he said that Lawrence looked right at him and said, if you tell anybody, I will kill you. And then like a couple days later, he sent someone to his house with a gun just to remind him that he should never talk about what, came out that night at the party. So he knew this was super serious, and he kept his mouth shut right up until he was dying, and then he confessed to this. Even after all of these witnesses coming forward, this case has still never been solved. Many of the suspects are dead now. Lawrence, of course, died. Paul has died. No one really knows where JJ is. This case just remains unsolved. I just can't believe that there is no justice for Tara Calico. I keep thinking of her poor mother, who, for years and years, thought justice for Tara, and there's never been closure for the family, which is just horrific. Anyway, as always, I'd love to know what you guys think in these cases. I just quickly want to cite my sources for this. I got information from Wikipedia, the website, the Tara Calico investigation, which is the Melinda Esquibel's website, and Vanished podcast. The search for Tara Calico also had a ton of information. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you next week.